Hello and welcome everyone to this second webinar in the series Museums Connect Without Borders. My name is Casper van der Kruit. I work as a press officer at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, well known for its large collections of 17th century Dutch masterpieces as Rembrandt's Night Watch and The Milkmaid by Johannes Vermeer, for example. I am your moderator for today's session. I would like to remind you that Persian interpretation is available and can be accessed via the interpretation channel at the bottom of the Zoom toolbar. And I would also like to inform you that the Arabic subtitles are embedded in the presentations, while AI-generated subtitles will be available for the remainder of the sessions. They are also accessible via the interpretation channel at the bottom of the Zoom toolbar. As said, this second webinar in the series Museum Without Borders, this is a one-year solidarity and capacity building initiative for museums and heritage professionals working in fragile and low resources context. The program aims to create spaces for learning, dialogue, and international solidarity. Today we have two presentations. The first will be by Niloofar Yazdkhasti. She is ICOM's vice chair, and the second presentation is by Heidi McKinnon, chair of ICOM ICME. They are both here, and maybe they can give a short introduction to themselves. Maybe you first, Nilo.
Yes, hello everyone. It's so good to see you all here, although virtually. Thank you, Casper. I will be briefly, first of all, talking about the whole project and this session. And again, I would like to thank you all for making it possible. Back to you, to you, Heidi, and then I will be talking about the whole session.
Thank you, Niloofar. My name's Heidi McKinnon. I'm the chair of ICOM ICME. It is an absolute pleasure to be here with all of you. And I welcome all of your comments and look forward to our conversation.
Thank you. If any of the participants have any questions, please submit them in the Q&A box. The Q&A box is the only place where questions that are asked there will be answered during the Q&A period. So, well, again, let me introduce our first speaker, Niloofar Yazdkhasti. She is a museum curator, researcher, and cultural heritage professional whose workforce focuses on museum communication, community engagement, and building inclusive and resilient museum practices. With more than a decade of experience across museums, cultural heritage, and international collaboration, she explores how museums can foster professional solidarity and equitable access to cultural and learning opportunities. In recent years, she has been awarded research fellowships at Université Polytechnique Hôte-de-France and ICOM IMREC, where her work has focused on digital leadership, values-led digital transformation, and community-centered museums. As vice chair of ICOM, she contributed to international initiatives that strengthen collaboration and support museum and heritage professionals worldwide. She is currently curating and leading Museums Connect Without Borders. This international solidarity initiative supports colleagues working in fragile and low-resource context. I'll give the floor to Niloofar.
Thank you, Casper. To get started, I would like to be honest, invite you to think about a simple question. And it's not a rough start, to be honest, but a simple question which says that, what do you think that happens when museums can no longer communicate freely? And on the other hand, what happens when communities are displaced, institutions are isolated, and professionals continue their work quietly, which is what we are doing in Iran currently, often unseen and unheard. And if I want to be frank, is that this was the main question that Museums Connect Without Borders was born from. And this initiative is not only, about capacity building. It is about recognizing that museum professionals, us, that we are all gathered today together, working under, kind of difficult circumstances. And we are not, to be honest, passive recipients of support. We are all knowledge holders. We are innovators. We are resilient practitioners whose voices deserve to be heard within our international museum community. As part of this initiative, that is why I want to make a kind request to all of you that we are also documenting stories of resilience from the field, which means we warmly invite all of you who wish to contribute to share photographs or short video clips that reflect your daily, work, your communities, or the realities of protecting heritage in your challenging circumstances. Obviously, with your permission, selected materials may become part of our project documentary, helping to ensure that these experiences are preserved and shared with a wider international audience. I will be sharing the email address in the chat box for your convenience. And about today. Today, we come together across borders and time zones to learn from one another and to imagine what ethical and community-centered museum practice can look like in times of crisis. Communication has the power, in my perspective, to include or exclude, to empower or silence, or to build trust or deepen divides. So for museums, communication is not simply what we say. To be honest, it is how we listen. So today's webinar, Ethical Communication and Community Engagement, invites all of us to reflect on these responsibilities and possibilities. Once again, thank you for being part of this growing community of museum professionals who believe that borders should never limit knowledge sharing, collaboration, and even care. Off we go for the presentation. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Today, I would like to talk about ethical communication, not as a communication strategy, but as a museum responsibility. This presentation is about people, relationships, and values that shape how museums communicate with and care for their communities, especially when vulnerability becomes part of everyday museum practice. I assume we all know that museums communicate all the time, not only through exhibitions, also educational programs or social media, but also through what they choose to say, what they choose not to say, and whose voices they choose to include. Communication is never neutral. It reflects our values, priorities, and responsibilities as museum professionals. Ethical communication begins when we understand that museums are not simply sharing information, they are building relationships. Therefore, when we talk about ethical communication in museums, we often celebrate visibility, participation, openness, and access. These are important values. However, we rarely ask ourselves that whether they are universally applicable. Are these values experienced in the same way across different museum realities and contexts? The answer is no. much of our conversations about museum communication assumes institutional stability. We assume museums have buildings, resources, institutional continuity, and the freedom to communicate openly with their communities. So these assumptions have shaped many of our professional frameworks and best practices. But what happens when these assumptions no longer hold? What happens when visibility may increase risk, when participation must be negotiated, and when ethical judgment becomes more important than visibility itself? So we want to look at it other way around. It means I don't want to talk about innovation as a marker of success. I want to talk about vulnerability. In museum literature, vulnerability is often treated as a limitation that institutions must overcome. I suggest something different. Vulnerability can be analytically productive. In fact, it reveals how museums make ethical decisions, negotiate responsibilities, and define meaningful transformation. Rather than asking how vulnerable museums can become like stable institutions, vulnerability allow us to ask what our existing frameworks may be taking for granted. And to be honest, visibility is not always the most ethical response. What is the context that I am talking about? I am talking about Irondell's Museum, a private community center museum that is dedicated to cultural diversity, heritage education, community engagement. So our work has always been rooted in storytelling and human connections. We work with people of different ages, backgrounds, and community through educational programs, exhibitions, and cultural initiatives. Community, in fact, has never been an additional component of our work. It has always been at its center. Following the 12-day war in June 2025 and the displacement of the museum, we lost our physical space and to this day do not have a permanent place to serve our communities. However, the museum has continued to engage with our communities through mobile and traveling exhibition, educational outreach programs, and digital communication. Rather than treating these conditions solely as limitations, I argue that they can be analytically productive. They allow us to rethink what meaningful communication, participation, and transformation actually look like in vulnerable museum contexts. Following that, I must say, ethical communication is not simply about communicating more. It is about communicating responsibly. Museums continuously make ethical decisions about, visibility, representation, participation, and care. But there are questions that we need to ask ourselves that are, what should we communicate? When should we communicate? Who may be affected? And what responsibilities do we have? These questions are not theoretical. They shape everyday museum practice and influence how institutions engage with their communities. As I have already stated out, vulnerable museum practice is rarely centered in museum communication and digital heritage research. Political constraint, cultural vulnerability, international isolation, and emotional labor are not exceptional circumstances in our everyday practice. They shape how we communicate, whom we communicate with, and how we engage our communities. These conditions are often absent from values-led and digital maturity framework that have largely emerged from Euro-American institutional context. Concepts such as openness, participation, access, visibility, frequently, presuppose safety, institutional continuity, and infrastructural security. But this case reminds us that these assumptions cannot always be taken for granted. Vulnerability is not, only institutional, it is also emotional. Museum work in vulnerable contexts requires continuous emotional labor, balancing care for communities as well as for heritage and institutional continuity and professional responsibility. One of the most important lessons I have learned from values-led approaches to digital transformation, and I would like to share with you, is that meaningful change begins with purpose rather than technologies. Ethical communication is therefore not separate from digital transformation. It is its foundation. Before asking what technologies museums should adopt, perhaps we should first ask what values we are trying to uphold. I want to be very clear about something. The framework I am about to introduce did not first, emerge from theory and then get applied to practice. It emerged exactly in the opposite direction, from life decisions, ethical tensions, and moments of uncertainty encountered during work at the Rijksmuseum Museum. Theory helped me name what was happening, but it did not dictate it at all. The framework is therefore not perspective, it is interpretive, an attempt to make visible what values already shaping practice under pressure. That is why I want to tell you that I came to understand that institutional resilience is not built through technology alone. It emerged through the interaction between ethical communication, community engagement, values-led decision-making, and meaningful digital practices. Human-centered digital resilience is the capacity of museums to sustain their mission, values, and relationships under conditions of vulnerability. In this model, the first point is empathy. Empathy functions as the foundational dimension of the framework. Here, empathy is not understood as sentiment or kindness alone. It refers to the capacity to recognize vulnerability of staff, communities, and of course, collections, and to act responsibly in response. In practice, this means asking not only what can be shared, but what should be shared and when and for whom. Empathy, therefore, shapes risk assessment, consent, and tone of communication and leadership behavior. It is the ethical condition that makes digital engagement or community engagement sustainable rather than extractive. Secondly, we have resilience. Resilience forms the stabilizing dimension of the framework. Rather than treating resilience as technical robustness or recovery capacity, we understand it as an organizational condition. It encompasses leadership continuity, institutional memory, resource stewardship, and the capacity to protect people as well as heritage over time. In crisis-affected contexts, resilience is not about growth. It is about endurance, ethical endurance, emotional endurance, and of course, institutional. And last but not least, connectivity. It represents the mediating dimension of the framework, the space where values become visible through action. In this context, connectivity is not about maximizing reach of engagement metrics. It refers to relational work of building trust-based networks, enabling participation, and sustaining dialogue across distance. Crucially, connectivity here is selective and negotiated. It involves knowing when to amplify voices and when restraint is the more ethical choice. While the three-dimensional values framework helps us understand what matters in values-led digital transformation, it does not yet explain how these values operate together in practice. Museums do not experience empathy, connectivity, and resilience in isolation. They encounter them at the same time, unevenly, and often under pressure. This raises a key question, frankly speaking, and it is that how do these values interact over time to produce sustainable institutional capacity, especially in crisis-affected contexts? In this slide, I am talking about the dynamic interaction of model of empathy, connectivity, and resilience. The model conceptualizes values-led digital transformation not as a linear progression, but as a recursive and stabilizing process. The triangular configuration reflects ongoing movement, tension, and reinforcement between values rather than stages to be completed. I will walk through each dimension briefly and focusing on how they relate to one another. In this model, empathy occupies the apex position. This placement is intentional. Empathy functions as the primary normative driver, the value through which digital decisions are evaluated before they are implemented. Empathic leadership shapes questions of visibility, participation, and risk. And on the other hand, it determines not only what is possible digitally, but what is appropriate under conditions of vulnerability. In this sense, empathy governs pace, tone, and restraint, especially where exposure may carry ethical or political consequences. So, in the interaction of empathy and connectivity, our practices become human-guided. Our communication become value-aligned. We are networking in an emotionally intelligent way. We use our platform in an empathy-informed way. From empathy, leadership flows to connectivity. In this model, connectivity functions as a mediating mechanism. It translates affective commitment into practice. This includes co-creation networks, participatory storytelling, digital fluency, and mediated engagement with dispersed publics. Importantly, connectivity here is not about scale or acceleration. It is about relational responsibility, negotiating voice, presence, and silence within the network cultural environment. So, in the interaction of connectivity and resilience, we have the capacity that is sustainable. Our communication networks become crisis ready, and our connectivity is based on low cost. We are resilient and by our network support. Resilience emerges at the base of the model as a stabilizing dimension. Rather than framing resilience as technical robustness, the model understands it as an organizational condition produced over time. It integrates sustainability, institutional memory, adaptive leadership, and strategic continuity. In crisis-affected contexts, resilience is not oriented toward optimization or growth. It is oriented toward endurance, maintaining ethical coherence under pressure. So, in the interaction of resilience and empathy, we have made a care-based adaptability. It means our leadership, our museum leadership, become emotionally sustainable. We are managing our institution in a very ethical crisis ready, and we are continuing serving our community in a care-informed manner. What this case demonstrates is that when those assumptions no longer hold, digital maturity cannot be understood simply as progress or optimization. And to be honest, instead, maturity must be reframed as the capacity to make ethical, value-consistent decisions under constraint. In this sense, vulnerability is not defect in the model. It becomes an analytical condition that reveals what digital transformation actually depends on. For instance, our museum Instagram account, among many museums in Iran, has a huge number of followers, but the key important moment was that after the museum closure, the museum share a donation appeal video viewed more than 40,000 times, illustrating how digital communication became a channel for care, solidarity, and institutional continuity. One of the things vulnerability has taught me is that resilience is never an individual or institutional achievement. It is relational, in fact. So, museums do not thrive in isolation. They thrive through collaboration, care, and solidarity. The idea behind Museums Connect Without Borders emerged from the very same concern. How can museums continue to support one another, share knowledge, and remain connected across geopolitical and institutional boundaries? Ethical communication, for me, is ultimately about building meaningful relationships, not only with our communities, but also with one another as museum professionals. At the end, I would like to conclude with one reflection. Vulnerability is often framed as something museums should overcome. My experience, though, suggests something different. Vulnerability can help us ask better questions about what museums are responsible for, who they serve, and what meaningful transformation should look like. Perhaps the future of ethical museum communication is not about becoming more digital, more visible, or more connected. Perhaps it is about becoming more human. Thank you for your time. In order to reach me out, if you have any questions or if you would like to develop this kind of a study, please feel free to write to me. Thank you. Thank you everyone for your applause. Casper.
Yeah, there I am again. I had some issues here, I think. I thank you, Niloofar, for your presentation. So if anyone has a question for Niloofar, submit them exclusively through the Q&A box. And again, I would like to remind you that Persian interpretation is available and can be accessed via the interpretation channel at the bottom of the Zoom toolbar. And also the Arabic subtitles are embedded in the presentation, while AI-generated subtitles will be available for the remainder of the session. Then now I would like to introduce the second speaker of today. It's Heidi McKinnon. She is a senior cultural leader with 25 years of experience working at an intersection of museum practice, human rights, and indigenous community collaborations across Latin America and the United States. Her work has centered on communicating sensitive histories with care, developing exhibitions on genocide, memory, and reparation in Guatemala, and co-curating the indigenous community in Brazil at the Smithsonian National Museum of American Indian. She went on to build the Museum of Freedom and Human Rights in Panama City as its deputy director, the country's first national institution dedicated to human rights. Through her nonprofit Curators Without Borders, she has developed emergency education and museum quality programming for communities affected by the conflict and displacements. As the board chair of ICOM International Community for Museum Ethnography, she is leading international initiatives on ethical data stewardships and post-colonial museum governance. So Heidi, it's to you.
Thank you so much, Casper. I assume we'll share the video now. Hello, everyone. My name is Heidi McKinnon, and I'm the chair of ICOM ICME, which is the international committee focused on museums and collections of ethnography. It's such a pleasure to be here with you today. I'm grateful to the entire ICOM Comms team for inviting ICME to be a partner in this webinar series and for the invitation to join you today to be a part of webinar 2. I'd like to dive directly into my PowerPoint. There we go. Let me get my little glasses. So today I am going to share 2 case studies from my work over the years. One took place in Brazil while I was working at the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian, and the second took place in Guatemala while I was working as an independent curator based in central Guatemala, working with an indigenous nonprofit. So before I start talking about the case studies, I wanted to share just a little bit of information about ICME. We are one of the original international committees of ICOM. We were founded in 1946. We currently have about 1,000 members, both institutional and individual. We focus on some of our working groups on decolonization, co-curation, shared stewardship issues. We are also currently very much focusing on AI issues and indigenous data sovereignty. And as a supporting partner of this webinar, we are extremely grateful for the work that ICOM Comms has done to put this together. And we look forward to all the future webinars with the team. As I said, today I'm talking about 2 separate projects that I worked on. The first I'll discuss took place in Brazil, and it revolves around sort of issues related to trying to stay out of the political sphere within your museum and things that one can do to achieve the goals that you might need to achieve to support the communities that you're working with. I'll start off with that one. This is the Alto Turiaçu in Brazil. It's a community, a demarcated indigenous community on the border of Pará and Maranhão in northeastern Brazil, south of the mouth of the Amazon River. The community that lives there is the Urubu Kapor. We began working with the Kapor community at the National Museum of the American Indian in the year 2000 to develop our inaugural exhibitions for the museum, which opened in 2004. So this was a very early example of a co-curatorial process, and I was extremely proud to be a part of it. This photo shows some of our co-curators and, well, all of our co-curators and the curatorial team, as well as our consultant from Tulane University, Bill Belay, on the far right, who became sort of an important part of the story that I'm going to share with you. So, as I mentioned, the Alto Turiaçu is in this sort of northeastern part of Brazil on the border with Pará. When you drive into this area of Brazil, when you drive towards the Alto Turiaçu, you're essentially driving through miles and miles of clear-cut forest, and then you see this island of trees off in the distance, and that's the Alto Turiaçu. It's one of the last remaining intact segments of the Amazon in this region, and therefore it's an incredibly important biosphere. When we first started working with the Kapor, our process was to visit them first and explain what we were trying to do with the exhibitions. We were working on an exhibition called Our Peoples, and it was focused on the history of 12 indigenous communities from throughout the hemisphere. So we had a very iterative process that we developed with each community. We would go out to the community, invite them to participate in the project, invite them to choose community curators who could work with us, who could travel to Washington and work with us in the collections and work with us on content on a regular basis, which is exactly what we did. So the Alto Turiaçu is a region that has about 13 different Kapor villages in it, or it did at this point in time in the year 2000 when we began working there. Obviously, it's demarcated land, it's legally recognized, but that doesn't stop anyone from going into the territory and illegally logging, which is what was actually happening when we first got in touch with the community. So land recognition was in place, but the community was left to a certain degree to defend the border of their indigenous territory themselves. When we invited our co-curators to Washington for the first time and we sat down, the very first day, practically the first thing that they said in our meetings was that they were visiting us because they needed to gather strength for the fight ahead, essentially. Their territory had been invaded by loggers, and they were literally unclear whether they were going to have to kill the loggers or whether the loggers were going to kill them. And this was how we started off our conversations about sharing the history of the Kapor community on the National Mall in the National Museum of the American Indian. It was something that we all had to sit with for a long time because, as I'm sure you're all aware and you understand from your own work, most museums are not involved directly in the politics of another government, in the politics of another country, and it made it quite difficult to see how we could support the community without crossing a line that was demarcated within the Smithsonian system. So our conversations were very creative. Obviously, we were talking about the project in general, but on this particular topic, the community members themselves were sharing ideas. They were wondering if we could somehow designate the Alto Turiaçu give it a research designation somehow, or talk to the Brazilian government about giving it some special protections because the Smithsonian was working with the community on an exhibition and a research project. And so there were many options that they had already thought about, obviously for them, and they shared this with us very clearly. Losing their land not only meant losing their language, it meant losing their entire culture. So there really was no option for them but to fight. And so we did the best that we could at the beginning to try to talk through approaches to discussing this story, to discussing illegal logging in the Amazon from the perspective of the community. And one of the strategies that we landed on, particularly our consultant, Bill Ballet from Tulane University, and I, we had a variety of conversations with counterparts at the Brazilian embassy. We developed relationships with them early on in the process, and they helped us with a variety of connections to FUNAI, which is the sort of the equivalent of the Bureau of Indian Affairs in the United States, or any government entity that focuses on supporting indigenous communities within their territory. So we were given direct connections to FUNAI and authorizations to work in the community without a great deal of constraint, which, was not usual. So we were very grateful for that, and grateful for our conversations with the staff at the embassy. We developed relationships with specific officers and kept in touch with them, not on a really regular basis, but, we touched base throughout the process. The research process took us about 4 years to develop the inaugural exhibition, Our Peoples, and then obviously installation and everything that follows. However, during those first few years, after we learned the gravity of the situation in the Alto Turiaçu and realized that it was not safe to visit there terribly often, we did have continued conversations with our counterparts at the embassy to try to express to them what we were expecting to have on the mall, that the story would be focused in part on logging. The long ago stories of the Kapor say that they are descended from hardwood trees and that their enemies are descended from softwood trees. And so even the design of our exhibition was focused on hardwood trees within the Alto Turiaçu community. Therefore, it was a story we could in no way work around, and we had no interest in not addressing it. So we made it somewhat clear to the embassy that this was something that we were working on with the Kapor, and that this is the story that 2 million people a year would be seeing on the National Mall. So fast forward to my last visit to Brazil for this project. I had the opportunity to do about a month or so of field work with some of the communities that we worked with. I visited Alto Turiaçu, and this photo is a photo from that visit. But the story behind it is really quite incredible. So within a year of our conversations with the embassy, at a certain point, we were told, not in any great detail, but we were told that the federal police intervened and they went into the Alto Turiaçu with helicopters, and they were heavily armed. And there was a gun battle with the loggers who had built a village in the demarcated territory. And the long and short of it was that the loggers were taken out of the Alto Turiaçu and the area was secured. When we learned this, we heard from the communities that they were going to found a new village on that border where the logging interests had created this incursion. You can see behind everyone, this is just an open, clear cut. This field had been part of the forest, a year or two prior to this, and it was now where the village was. So about 6 months after the federal police entered the Alto Turiaçu, I was able to go in to the community with Bill Ballet, with our videographers, with our photographers, with our team, to do the work that we needed to do for the exhibitions, which involved taking photos of hardwood trees, that some of which were impossible to find, and we had to go to arboretums in other parts of Brazil to get images of the bark that we needed for the design of the space. So that in and of itself was impactful to realize just the extent of the devastation within the forest after we arrived. So as we drove into the Alto Turiaçu, as I mentioned previously, we were seeing nothing but clear-cut trees and then this island of forest. We passed through the logging camp and saw all of their equipment. We took a little tour of that area and then moved on to the village, where we spent about a week or so working with the community on the final preparations for the exhibition. And this photo was taken with everyone in the community. It's a 360-degree image that was included in the exhibition, and it really shows the strength of the community. Each of the 13 communities in the rest of the Alto Turiaçu sent one family to found Guru Piuna, which was the name of this particular village. And that was where we did all of our interviews. We had interviews with some of the community members in the exhibition. We showed a little bit of what was happening. You can't really see terribly well in this image here, but this is Valdemar Kapoor. He's one of the caciques for this particular community. And he's actually sitting on top of a pile of hardwood trees that were harvested from the forest. So these trees were sitting there, these logs were sitting there when the federal police went into the community to get out the illegal loggers. And so they were going to be shipped off imminently. The community themselves decided that they would take these logs and actually sell them in order to buy trucks and supplies and materials for Guru Piuna, because the purpose of founding Guru Piuna was to patrol the southern border of Alto Turiaçu on a regular basis. So in essence, the story that we were able to tell on the mall in American Indian was one of triumph in a way. The community was resilient. No one to that point had died because of involvement with illegal logging in the region. That changed after the opening of the museum. It had nothing to do particularly with the museum. It was just evolving situation in their region in Maranhão. But at this point, the story was that the community was able to overcome the incursion of the illegal loggers and stop it and secure their forest and hence secure their culture and their community's livelihood. So that story, it was very powerful for me to see how just our conversations with our counterparts in the diplomatic corps could have had a really positive impact on one of our partner communities for the inaugural exhibitions. And I felt that it was important to share because it really shows the value of cultural capital, I believe, and how one should never underestimate it. I have some points that I'd like to share at the very end, but that's one that really sticks with me whenever I think about this story. During the opening of the exhibition, we had the Brazilian diplomatic team visit with us. They hosted the Kapor and the Tapirapay visitors and co-curators while they were in Washington. And it was a very enriching and positive experience for all of them. And I know that the Kapor community was really grateful for the collaboration and the friendship and the trust that we had in each other. And it allowed us to really kind of do a few things on their behalf that were clearly not possible for them to achieve on their own at that particular moment, and may have been different under different circumstances, but they were really facing a serious incursion. And luckily, we were able to support them to stop that. The second case study that I'd like to share comes from my work in Guatemala. I moved to Guatemala within a year or so of finishing my work for the American Indian Museum. And some of the work that I wanted to do in Guatemala related to things that we had intended to include at one point in the inaugural exhibitions on the mall for American Indian, but for a variety of reasons, it just wasn't possible to include those particular stories. Obviously, you can never include every story that you want to in that kind of a project. So moving on to Guatemala, I lived in Guatemala from 2008, between 2008 and 2012. And I worked with an indigenous nonprofit called Adivima in the central part of Guatemala in Baja Verapaz, in a town called Rabinal. And Adivima was founded to support the survivors of the construction of a dam and a genocide that occurred in Guatemala during the internal conflict. So I moved to Guatemala about 12 years after the peace accords were signed. So this was a very serious post-conflict landscape in Guatemala at the time. And this exhibition that I ended up touring, which is called Water, Rivers, and People, was a project that focused on the human right to water. It focused quite a lot on the effects of dams and mining on indigenous communities around the world. And I had the very great pleasure of touring it through quite rural regions of Guatemala over the course of my time in country. So the Chixoy Dam is located in the Alta Verapaz region, but still central Guatemala. The Verapazes are two departments that are connected. You can see on the left the river basin, the Rio Negro River Basin, and on the right, the Compuerta, the dam itself. This dam today still offers the entire country of Guatemala about 40% of its electricity. And still today, I would say very few people understand the price of that electricity, because during the internal conflict, um, there were about 5 different communities that lived in this river basin that experienced genocides associated with the construction of the dam. Their communities were going to be flooded. They lost all of their fruit-bearing trees, all of their cattle, and any kind of livestock they may have had. They lost their land. When I moved to Rabinal, at that point, there were a little over 10,000 internally displaced people from the Mayachi community who were affected by the construction of the dam and also by the genocides that were perpetrated during the construction of the dam. So, as I said, I worked with Adivima. This photo, the first person you see here, his name is Carlos Chen, and he's one of the founders of Adivima, and his wife and various family members from Rio Negro, which is the community that you see here down below where they are. Walking is the new Rio Negro. The old Rio Negro was flooded by the dam's construction. And Carlos and various other community members founded Adivima to support all of the internally displaced communities, to try to fight for reparations for these communities. And when I moved to Rabinal, my work was supporting the reparation negotiation that was ongoing with the president's office. President Colom at the time was the very first center-left president in Guatemala since the overthrow of Arbenz in the 1950s, and the destabilization and obviously the internal conflict that occurred in the decades following that. So it was a real window of opportunity for Adivima and for the community to have Colom as president. He agreed to open a negotiation with the community. And when I moved to Rabinal, my job was really to support the development of the creation of an economic development plan for artists from all of the different displaced communities. And secondly, a plan for a memorial museum to be associated with the reparations package. Both of those things were included in the final reparations package, which came about many years after I left, but luckily they did receive some recompense for the monetary damages that occurred. The genocides have never formally been addressed, and there have been no reparations regarding the genocides that occurred in the different villages in the Mayachi community. Over 500 different people were killed during the construction of the dam, which is it's probably still the only instance of a genocide associated with the construction of a dam that I'm aware of to date. So it was a very particular event, and obviously extremely serious for this particular community. Today, all of the displaced peoples are still living in the communities where they were displaced to. The reparations have been helpful to a certain extent, but those reparation packages in other instances of dam-affected communities in other regions of the world, particularly Chile, it's not always, it doesn't always turn out for the best. However, in this case, it really has been an economic benefit to the community. So my work with Adivima and within the community also involved interviewing genocide survivors, interviewing people who were around during the construction of the dam, in an effort to develop an exhibition for Adivima to support their advocacy work around this program, because not only were they focused on the monetary reparations for the loss of land. They were also pushing at the same time for reparations for the genocide. The photo that you see here is she's the daughter of one of the people who lost their lives during the Rio Negro massacre. And we did a project with a lot of community members that focused on creating memorial quilts for genocide survivors. That was another project that I did at this time. But the main focus for me was developing an exhibition around the genocide and the construction of the dam that would be kind of an advocacy tool for the community and for Adivima. And that happened within the first year that I was in Guatemala. I was contacted by an institution in Spain, a nonprofit called Agua Ríos y Pueblos, and they were developing an exhibition about the human right to water called Water, Rivers, and Peoples. It toured in Europe. It moved to Mexico. They were very interested in including the Chicxoy story. And so I basically handed over all of my research materials and developed a segment of the exhibition for them. So the exhibition was about 1,000 square meters, 10,000 square feet. It had over 30 case studies from all around the world, both positive and negative, regarding mining, dams, water quality issues. And as you can see here, I toured it mostly as an outdoor exhibition, an open air exhibition. My initial partner in this was a museum that was associated with an embassy in Antigua, Guatemala. Beautiful museum. It's a wonderful place to have an exhibition. And about a year before our exhibition was intended to open, the ambassador decided that the Chicxoy story was just a bit too controversial to touch for the museum, because they were there in a diplomatic capacity and there were these ongoing reparation negotiations. And while I understood it, it really felt like a crash and burn moment for the entire project. But luckily, we were able, through the museum staff, to develop relationships with the vice president's office, with the sister of the current president, Colom, because she was a lawyer focused on water rights issues, and the vice president was trying to develop a ministry of water. So it was just happenstance that that we were allowed to have these connections, that we made these connections, and I made the case for the exhibition to the vice president and his entire team, and they were very much on board and supported the exhibition. We opened the exhibition in the National Palace. You can see a photo on the left of the vice president and the president of Agua Ríos y Pueblos and various ministers, the president's sister, opening the exhibition in the National Palace in Guatemala City. We also had a section of the exhibition that was outdoors. We had a memorandum of understanding with the Ministry of Education. So we had school groups coming through every single day. Throughout our tour, we had a 10-month tour around the country, and we were supported by various civil society organizations that I had met throughout my time working with Adivima. The military, interestingly enough, because of our connection with the vice president, all of their support was in kind, and they helped us with transportation, sometimes with install and deinstall. And the photo on the right, I included it because it shows our installation in Antigua. There might be another one later on that shows some people in Antigua as well. But this was interesting to me because although the embassy chose not to accept our exhibition after initially approving it, they wanted to find sort of back doors to work with us. And so their team helped us install and deinstall the entire 10,000 square foot exhibition in the park and in the central plaza of Antigua after we were given permission by the mayor of Antigua to host the exhibition for 2 months in the city. So from a very dark point where we felt like the exhibition wasn't going to happen at all because we didn't have a partner, we ended up having sort of a much broader focus in terms of our tour across the country. We visited 8 or 9 different communities, and obviously the civil society organizations like Adivima and other civil society organizations that were specifically focused on communities affected by mining or affected by dams were our major partners. We were supported as well by several embassies and by a UN agency, FAO, as well as the Academy of Mayan Languages in Guatemala. So we toured the exhibition through a series of cultural centers that the Academy of Mayan Languages had built with support from the Embassy of Norway. There were at least 4 throughout the country, and we were able to visit all of them and again reached quite a large number of students in each community. I think overall we had over 5,000 student visits. Overall for the exhibition tour, we reached about 100,000 people in Guatemala City, in Antigua, and then in all of the smaller communities that we visited. The photo on the top right was from the East Shield Triangle, and we set the exhibition up in basically a building that was practically abandoned, that was used as a soccer field for local students, but that was where the Academy of Mayan Languages, because their center wasn't quite finished in that community, they worked with us to host the exhibition here. And it was a massive success. We had thousands of people visit over a period of 2 weeks. And so all the successes and all of the wins that we had were also somewhat offset by the risks and the difficulties of developing a tour of an exhibition of this kind in the context that we were working in. This photo is from a town called San Miguel Ixthuacan, which is in sort of northwestern Guatemala. And this is a mining town. And I specifically wanted to take the exhibition there. We had a very strong partnership with a civil society indigenous organization that worked against the Goldcorp gold mine, which was active in San Miguel. What was happening at that time was quite serious. Goldcorp was developing relationships with mayors of these small communities and taking communal lands, converting them into private property, and then allowing Goldcorp to purchase it so that they could mine underneath the communities. So they were digging about half of a mile or a mile underneath all of these small communities, and the blasts within the mine were damaging people's homes. If anyone was trying to stand up against Goldcorp, they would face a variety of consequences. Some people were, physically assaulted. Some people were experiencing coercion from local authorities, all coordinated with Goldcorp to a certain degree, was my understanding of the situation. So when we arrived in San Miguel Ixthuacan, the civil society organization I was working with insisted that I stay in the parroquia, in the Catholic church property. So I stayed on the grounds of the Catholic Church. I did not leave the grounds of the Catholic Church except to go eat sometimes right across the street. We held the exhibition on in the patio in front of the church. So it was a fenced church property. I believe this photograph is from one of the openings, or the main opening of the exhibition. And on that day, I had people pitching beer bottles at me and at the exhibition itself. And I was told that within 1 or 2, potentially 2 days, the Goldcorp mine managers installed an exhibition within the mine itself to ensure their workers that there were no water quality issues associated with the tailings ponds that Goldcorp had developed to mine gold out of the mountains in this region. And of course, that's most likely untrue, but the fact that they were so concerned about the installation of this exhibition in front of the church that they felt the need to respond with their own exhibition said a lot to me. And as I said, I was confined to the church property for my own safety. We did a serious amount of public programming along with this exhibition, but it was all clandestine. We couldn't advertise. I was simply told at a time to be picked up at the church, and I hopped in a car. I had to hide in the back seat until we got out of town, and then we would arrive in a community like this. And this is Las Escobas. This is one of our public programs in a community. This is what it looked like in every community. The entire community came out for the programming. In some cases, community members were concerned about going to see the exhibition because they were concerned about repercussions from staff who worked at the mine, I suppose. So we would have a sort of a film series that we would go through, films that focused on mining both in Guatemala and in other regions like in Peru. The Catamarca mine was one in particular. And we would have discussions. I would get to hear, what people's concerns and fears were. We worked with children. We had educational programming for them, where they were allowed to share their thoughts on water quality in their community and, what made them concerned about the mine itself. And so although it was clandestine, it was a complete success. And I couldn't even tell you how many people we reached in each one of those events. I don't even count that in the 100,000 mark for visitors to the exhibition. But it was not easy. It was a situation in which my phone was tapped at times. I could tell that my phone was tapped. I had to move in a very deliberate manner. I had to have quite good connections with all of our supporters, so everyone knew where I was at all times and what was happening with the exhibition. Not all of our stops along this tour of the exhibition were quite like San Miguel Ixthuacan, but working in this sort of post-conflict period, these things happen. So what I found most useful was the trust and the connections that I had with all of our civil society organizations, the connections and the backing that I had from the embassies that we worked with. And without those networks, it simply wouldn't have been possible to do this work. So in closing, what I like to say, I'd like to touch on just a few things. My feeling is that I was successful with what I did because for a variety of reasons, I built the right networks before the crisis points happened, and we had the connections that we needed to have in a very broad way. So my suggestion for working in a more difficult context is to really spend the time to develop those external relationships in many different sectors and many different ways. Diplomatic, civil society, multilateral agencies, government contacts. You really never know what kind of support you're going to get from a government agency that you might not think is interested in supporting what you're doing. So I think that I wound up in Guatemala and worked on this exhibition at a moment that the government was focused on water issues, and so it really opened up a door for me. That's not always going to be the case, that somebody has a stroke of luck like that, but developing those relationships across many sectors is invaluable. I also think, in the case of the Kapor and all of the communities that we worked with across Latin America, trust, so important. You develop that over time. I think it's important to ensure that you're building time into your projects, time for the relationships to develop and for people to really understand what you're trying to achieve and ensure that they know that you have their back and that you are a trusted entity, not just as an individual, but as an organization. Again, I want to reiterate, as I mentioned with the Smithsonian case, cultural capital is real. It's important. It's important to use it wisely and deliberately, and when it's necessary. So never overlook the cultural capital that your institution has within its community. It's highly important and relevant. And again, with our work with the diplomatic corps in Brazil, silence can have a cost. So allowing people to understand that in more of an indirect way can be very useful. Let them make the decisions that they need to make, but be clear about what potential consequences there are surrounding a project that you're working on that might affect a particular community or a particular country. And I always think, I say here, plan for fracture, but, something is always going to happen that will throw you off of your goal or throw you off course a bit. And so ensuring that you have those networks and you have contingency plans for any work that you might be doing with a community is going to really help you along the way when you hit a choke point or hit a moment where something might go wrong or your plan has to deviate. Just having that network allows you to have many more choices to move forward. And so that's, I think, what I would like to leave you with. Individual relationships are really the heart of everything. And no matter how risky some project may be or how dangerous it may be, relationships will help you get through it. Thank you so much for your time. And I appreciate the opportunity to visit with you.
Okay, thank you very much, Heidi, for your presentation. Thank you very much again for the presentation, and it sounded like quite an adventure what you did there in Guatemala. We now have time for a Q&A, so please submit your questions in the Q&A part of the Zoom, and then we can answer those questions. I have one question for you, Heidi. you were talking about what you did in Brazil and in Guatemala. Can you tell something about the lasting impact the project made for these local communities where you were doing the project for?
Oh, thank you for the question. In terms of Guatemala, I think that we had a lasting impact in a variety of different ways with our student groups. We definitely were changing minds about, um, you know, what impacts water quality in your community. We talked about all sorts of things. One of the issues that was coming up at that point was the palm oil industry was entering Guatemala at this time. So we had the opportunity to talk to students about that and about the environmental effects and how their individual choices really impacted their environment just in terms of what they were eating and anything that they might be having that had those sort of detrimental palm oils in them. We had a lot of conversations with students who lived in communities who were facing the construction of dams. And so we gave them constructive ideas about how they could try to push back through legal channels within their community to save their waterways. Those kinds of things. For the communities and the civil organizations that were facing mining companies, in some sense, there was a time limit to that because the companies were within a couple of years finishing their mining. They had taken all the gold and they were leaving anyway. But those civil society organizations felt that the exhibition was extremely useful for them. We gave them copies of all the materials so that they could continue their advocacy in communities and working with student groups as well to understand the effects of mining. We also held a symposium with a Canadian water advocate named Maud Barlow. She's written extensively on water issues around the world. And so we've focused specifically on women in communities who were affected by mining and did a small tour around Guatemala with her and with all those women so that we could connect all of the different advocates together and they could support each other over time. After the exhibition finished, I'm sure were many other outcomes for Brazil. As I mentioned, our work was sort of a temporary stopgap. Within a few years, the situation became so grave. People were dying in the Alto Turiaçu. People would be kidnapped when they left the forest by loggers. The loggers would say, "We will kill you. We will kill your family if you do not take us to this kind of a hardwood tree." So right now, it's a very unsafe environment. And there are many other organizations that are working on these issues, but on the National Mall, I would every year or so send a little bit of an update of the information that I had to our education teams so that they, in turn, as they were doing tours, could share with people what was going on in the Amazon and let those visitors make decisions about how they could, in their own way, try to support efforts to end logging or to support the communities that we worked with.
Very, very good. Thank you for your answer. Did you also manage to get these get any publications, get the press to write about this?
I would say we did not. In terms of the mall exhibitions, it wasn't, the focus was much more on the creation of a new National Museum of Indigenous culture. And so it was kind of a broader focus. We didn't specifically talk about these issues. This may be the first time that I've ever shared that particular story publicly.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I think this one is a question for Niloofar. Did crisis management plan in place during disaster with Iranian museums play an effective role in protecting museum heritage?
Thank you to you and also for the person who has questioned. I would say that the recent experience in Iran has, highlighted both the importance of, crisis preparedness and, of course, the remarkable efforts of museums and heritage professionals working under very, difficult circumstances. And to be honest, if I want to very briefly, maybe, give you the short report, is that following the recent the last year 12-day war in June, many museums had already, taken precautionary measures and were, it was possible. Collections, for instance, collections were secured or moved to safer locations. And I have to be honest with this, that my colleagues worked tirelessly before, during, and after the conflict to protect collections and, ensure their safety. So, and even now, to be honest, because still we are in the fragile situation. At the same time, the situation has also reminded us that there is a limit of what emergency preparedness can achieve, and it is that not all heritage can be moved. A number of sites and historic buildings affected by the conflict are immovable heritage. They are World Heritage sites. So in these cases, protections, requires a very different set of emergency conversation measures. But since this webinar series, this one specifically is about communication, I remember one of the key points that was emphasized by the director of the National Museum of Iran, Dr. Jabrail Nokande, is that communication is a key for preservation. It means it has to be a direct, transparent communication between members and staff of the museum, between their security, between the forces and army and even firefighters. Everyone there has to be a clear challenge between them during and after these kind of crises. And I would also warmly encourage you to join our next webinar, which is in August 20. We will be talking about emergency conservation practices, but specifically we will also have a case from Iran that what were those measures that has been taken. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Niloofar. One last question I have here. Given the importance of ethical communication and international museum cooperation, how has ICOM maintained professional and direct communication with the National Museum of Afghanistan since the political changes in 2021? What concrete steps has ICOM taken to strengthen this relationship, support museum professionals, and facilitate continued international cooperation for the protection and preservation of Afghanistan's cultural heritage? Who can I give the word? Niloofar, I see you nodding.
Yeah, Mr. Sultani, I hear where you're coming from, to be honest, because there has been lots of, to be honest, damages to our shared heritage, and there has been limited attention to this matter, to be honest, globally. And I give you an example from Iran. For instance, 150 heritage sites and museums in Iran in the last 6 months has been damaged very, strongly. But there has been just a slightly attention of the global organizations. I'm not here to criticize any of them, but this is the reality. And we all know, I think, as Afghanistan, as people of Afghanistan or professionals from Afghanistan or as professionals from Iran, we know we have to fight for our rights. But on the other hand, I know that, for instance, for this particular activity, Afghanistan is a little ahead of us because there is a ICOM red list about heritage of lost heritage of Afghanistan, and I can say that these concrete actions have including monitoring the situation through ICOM's heritage protection network, supporting the use and this dissemination of the ICOM red list of Afghanistan antiquities at risk to help prevent illicit trafficking and maintaining professional networks that allow our dear Afghan colleagues to remain connected to the international museum community. My advice is that please do apply for ICOM National Committee of Afghanistan through the a connection that you can make and gather a collective voice of having a representative in the ICOM international community, and you can always count on me or ICOM comes to facilitate this relationship with ICOM Home Office.
Thank you, Niloofar, for your answer to this question. This is almost the end of this this second session from Museums Connect Without Borders. I would like to thank both of our speakers, Niloofar Yazdkhasti and Heidi McKinnon. Thank you very much, both of you, for your time. And I would also like to thank all the participants for joining here today at this webinar. The next webinar will be take place on August 20, 4 p.m. Central European Summertime, and the subject then will be emerging conservation practices. The recording of this presentation and all the presentation materials will be shared with all of you after the session. And we now like to take a picture of all the participants. So we would kindly like to ask you to turn on your camera so we can see you and take a picture of all of you.